arrival at Karkoj. During the end of November the Sheikh Bakr, who had deserted the Dervishes after their retreat from Gedaref, arrived at Karkoj with 350 irregulars. He claimed to have defeated his former chief many times, and produced a sack of heads as evidence of his success. His loyalty being thus placed beyond doubt, he was sent to keep contact with the Dervishes, and encouraged to the greatest efforts by the permission to appropriate whatever spoils of war he could capture. Meanwhile, Ahmed Fadil was working his way slowly southward along a deep khor which runs almost parallel to the Blue Nile, and is perhaps 20 miles from it. As soon as the position of the Dervish Emir was definitely known, Colonel Lewis moved his force, which had been strengthened by detachments of the 10th Soudanese, from Karkoj to Rosaires. Here he remained for several days, with but little hope of obstructing the enemy's passage of the river. On the 20th of December, however, full, though, as was afterwards found, not very accurate, information was received. It was reported that on the 18th Ahmed Fedil had reached the village of Dakhila, about 20 miles south of the Rosaires post, that he himself had immediately crossed with his advance guard, and was busily passing the women and children across the river on rafts. On the 22nd, therefore, Colonel Lewis hurried the Sheikh Bakr up the west bank to cut off their flocks and harass the Dervishes who had already crossed the river. The irregulars accordingly departed, and on the next day news was brought that the Dervish force was almost equally divided by the Blue Nile, half being on one bank and half on the other. At midday on the 24th, the gunboats Melik and Dal arrived from Omdurman with a detachment of 200 more men of the 10th Soudanese under Major Ferguson, and 30 men of the 9th Soudanese under Captain Sir Henry Hill. With this addition, the force at Colonel Lewis's disposal consisted of half the 10th Soudanese, a small detachment of the 9th Soudanese, 2 Maxim guns, and a doctor. Besides the regular troops, there were also the band of irregulars under the Sheikh Bakr, numbering 380 men, 100 men under the Sheikh of Rosaires, and a few other unclassified scallywags. Colonel Lewis determined to attack what part of Ahmed Fadil's force still remained on the east bank of the river, and on Christmas Day, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, he marched with every man he could muster in the direction of Dakhila. Moving in single file along a track which led through a dense forest of thorny trees, the column reached Adu Zakoli, a village thought to be half, but really not 1/3, of the way to Dakhila, at 11 o'clock on Christmas night. Here they bivouacked until 3 a.m. on the 26th, when the march was resumed in the same straggling order through the same tangled scrub. Daylight found them still several miles from the Dervish position, and it was not until 8 o'clock that the enemy's outposts were discovered. After a few shots the Arab picket fell back, and the advance guard, hurrying after them, emerged from the forest upon the open ground of the river bank, broken only by palms and patches of high grass. Into this space the whole column gradually debouched. Before them the Blue Nile, shining in the early sunlight like a silver band, flowed swiftly, and beyond its nearest waters rose a long, bare, gravel island crowned with clumps of sandhills, to the shelter of which several hundred Dervishes, surprised by the sudden arrival of the troops, were scampering. Beyond the island, on the tall tree-clad cliff of the further bank, other minute figures moved and bustled. The discordant sound of horns and drums floating across the waters, and the unfurling of many bright flags, proclaimed the presence and the intention of the hostile force. The Dervish position was well chosen and of great defensive strength. A little to the north of Dakhila the Blue Nile bifurcates, one rapid but shallow stream flowing fairly straight under the east bank, another very deep stream running in a wide curve under the west bank, cutting into it so that it is precipitous. These two branches of the river enclose an island 1.25 miles long by 1,400 yards wide, and on this island, surrounded by a natural moat of swiftly flowing water, was the Dervish Dem. The western side of the island rose into a line of low sandhills covered with scrub and grass, with a steep reverse slope towards the foreshore of the river bank, and here, in this excellent cover, what eventually proved to be three-quarters of the force of Ahmed Fedil were drawn up. Backed against the deep arm of the river, they had no choice, nor indeed any other wish, but to fight. Before them stretched a bare slope of heavy shingle, 1,000 yards wide, over which their enemies must advance to the attack. Behind them the high precipitous west bank of the river, which rose in some places to a height of 50 feet, was lined with the 300 riflemen who had already crossed, and from this secure position Ahmed Fedil and 4 of his Emirs were able to watch, assist, and direct the defence of the island. The force on the island was under the sole command of the Emir Sa'adallah, of Gedaref repute, but, besides his own followers, most of the men of the 4 other Emirs were concentrated there. The prospect was uninviting. Colonel Lewis discovered that he had absurdly underrated the strength and discipline of the Dervish force. It had been continually reported that the defeats at Gedaref had demoralised them, and that their numbers did not exceed 2,000 men. Moreover, he had marched to the attack in the belief that they were equally divided on both sides of the river. Retreat was, however, impossible. Strong as was the position of the enemy, formidable as was their strength, the direct assault was actually safer than a retirement through the 19 miles of gloomy forest which lay between the adventurous column and Rosaires. The British officer immediately determined to engage. At 9 o'clock the 2 Maxims, which represented the artillery of the little force, came into action in good positions, while the 10th Soudanese and most of the irregulars lined the east bank. Musketry and Maxim fire was now opened at long range. The Dervishes replied, and as the smoke of their rifles gradually revealed their position and their numbers, it soon became evident that no long-range fire could dislodge them, and Colonel Lewis resolved, in spite of the great disparity of force and disadvantage of ground, to attack them with the bayonet. Some time was spent in finding fords across the interposing arm of the river, and it was not until past 10 o'clock that Bakir's men crossed on to the island, and, supported by a company of the 10th Soudanese, advanced toward the enemy's right and took up a position at about 800 yards from their line, to cover the rest of the passage. Colonel Lewis now determined to turn the enemy's left from the north, attack them in flank, and roll them into the deep part of the river. With the 10th Soudanese, under Colonel Nason and Major Ferguson, he marched southwards along the river's edge, sheltering as far as possible under the curve of the bank from the fire, which now began to cause casualties. Having reached the position from which it was determined to deliver the attack, the battalion deployed into line, and changing front half left, advanced obliquely by alternate companies across the bare shingle towards the sandhills. As they advanced, a galling fire was opened upon the left flank by 200 Dervishes admirably placed on a knoll. Major Ferguson was detached with 1 company to dislodge them. The remaining 4 companies continued the attack. The Dervish musketry now became intense. The whole front of the island position was lined with smoke, and behind it, on the high cliff of the west bank, a long half-circle of riflemen directed a second tier of converging bullets upon the 400 charging men. The shingle jumped and stirred in all directions as it was struck. A hideous whistling filled the air. The Soudanese began to drop on all sides, just like the Dervishes at Omdurman, and the ground was soon dotted with the bodies of the killed and wounded. "We did not," said an officer, "dare to look back." But undaunted by fire and crossfire, the heroic black soldiers, demons who would not be denied, pressed forward without the slightest check or hesitation, and, increasing their pace to a swift run in their eagerness to close with the enemy, reached the first sandhills and found cover beneath them. A quarter of the battalion had already fallen and lay strewn on the shingle. The rapidity of their advance had exhausted the Soudanese, and Lewis ordered Nason to halt under cover of the sandhills for a few minutes, so that the soldiers might get their breath.